good. So we'll have a little look at Purim, the ideas behind Purim. Anyway, it's a fascinating story. It's a famous story that the Jewish people were in Persia, and Achashverosh, the king, makes an enormous Suda, he makes an enormous meal because he wants to celebrate the fact that the time that was prophesied that the Jewish people would be out of Israel with the destruction of the first temple had passed already. And he worked on the premise, he assumed that God must have given up on the Jews, and therefore he made a big party. It really was a big party. It lasted for 180 days. That's a pretty big party, right? Even for college students, that's like pretty serious, right?
For Persians, it's
okay, but maybe not for Persians, but so long as somebody else is paying, right? Yeah. So he made a party for 180 days, and then he made a separate party for an extra 7 days for the people who lived in the capital city of Shushan. Now, Mordechai, who was the leader of the Jewish community in Shushan, told the Jewish people not to go. It wasn't a place for them to be. Even if there was going to be kosher food over there, it wasn't the environment and the atmosphere that they were supposed to be in. It was going to be lacking, completely lacking in modesty, the whole thing that was going on over there. Of course, the Jewish people didn't listen. Perhaps Mordechai should have told them they have to go. And then at that point, maybe they would have said they're not going because they would have done the opposite. But they went, and at that point, that sparked off a whole spiritual reaction, which involved somebody called Haman, who was a direct descendant of Agag from Amalek, becoming the prime minister to Achashverosh, and decrees that were decreed upon the Jewish people, and subsequently the Jewish people having to do tshuva, to turn back to God, and ultimately everything turns out okay. And the Jewish people spend a day outside of Shushan and 2 days within Shushan, having to fight against their enemies until finally they were victorious. And on the 14th and on the 15th of Adar, on the 14th of Adar outside of Jerusalem, on the 15th of Adar inside of Jerusalem, we celebrate Purim. The halachas of Purim are relatively simple. You've got to go to shul, they read the Megillah. Megillah's Esther tells over the story of what took place over there. There's a fascinating little side thing that the name of God does not appear in Megillah's Esther in an overt fashion. It's not written over there at all. Interesting enough, if anybody here has any good with handwriting, calligraphy, so Sofrim, people who write Sifrei Torah, write mezuzahs and tefillin, they normally start off their careers writing Megillah's Esther, because in Megillah's Esther there's no name of God, so you can't. Even if you make a mistake, you just go back, erase it, start again. If you make a mistake writing the name of God inside of a Sefer Torah, for example, it can have a pretty large repercussion with regards to what has to be done, how to redo it, how much has to be rewritten. It's something which is relatively complicated. And even if you make some mistake inside of a column that's God's name in it, depends what kind of a mistake he made, depends on exactly how much he's going to have to do in order to rectify the problem. So it's a fascinating idea. The sages already point out that inside of the Megillah, very often Achashverosh is called Melech Achashverosh, which means King Achashverosh, and very often he's just called HaMelech, he's called the king. And the sages point out that if you follow the story, if you use the HaMelech as referring to God, you'll see a whole new story unfolds, a story within a story. It's very, very deep, the Megillah. It's a very, very deep story. It's a very fascinating story. It's a very riveting story as well. And that's read. It's going to be read twice in Mitzvah Hashem. Next week we'll talk about the halachot, and we'll discuss, when you're supposed to read it and how you're supposed to read it. But it's read twice on Purim, once at night and once during the day. There is a mitzvah to have a meal on Purim night. Not a big one. It doesn't have to be a big one, but at least to sit down and eat something. And there is of course on Purim day is a rather short day. It's lots has to be done. This year it's even more complicated because in Jerusalem it's going to be on Friday. And that means that you got to get all your mitzvahs done as early as possible, including eating your meal and getting drunk, because you're supposed to walk into Shabbos in some kind of a state of being, not in a drunken stupor. So whatever, we have to work out whether that is doable or not. But Adar itself, like we mentioned yesterday, it's a month. It's a month of great joy. It's a month of great happiness. The idea of finding God inside of the darkness, the idea of being able to identify God's fingerprints all over everything that happens. And if each month has got like an essence that's contained inside of it, it's got like a concentrated essence of what that month stands for, then I imagine that the month of Adar is really the idea of being able to recognize God even in the darkest of times, being able to recognize God and being able to connect together with God. And maybe that's where the concept of Adar being a month of joy comes from, right? As we mentioned yesterday, it says that Misha Nichnas Adar Ma'abim B'Simcha, that when Adar comes in, we have to be even more joyous than we normally are. It's now Rosh Chodesh Adar today, which is why I can see, you are exuding joy and happiness. I can see it, Bernie. Don't try to hide it. It's just impossible to miss. So the idea of Purim is the idea of tapping into God. The Megillah was written in Golus, in exile, right? We're in Persia under the heel of Achashverosh, and nevertheless God goes into Golus together with us, into exile together with us, and He looks after us when we're in exile as well, even though sometimes it's hard to see. In the Pasuk at the end of the book of Dvarim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, "Hastir panai," that I will conceal my face. It's a double word, conceal my face, which means there'll be a time in history when it'll be very difficult to find. And the Gemara asks, the heroine of the book of Esther is Esther. And the Gemara asks, where do we see an allusion to Esther in the Torah itself? Where do we see that? And the Gemara says, Hastir panai. Astir, which means to be hidden, and Esther, the whole story of Esther is the idea of Esther hiding her origins and hiding the fact that she was Jewish and hiding the fact that she wanted to try to preempt Haman's plan against the Jewish people. And all of that, everything is hidden. So inside of the Megillah, everything is hidden. One of the reasons why it's given, why we get dressed up on Purim, is because when you're dressed up, you're hidden. You're not the same person as you are normally when you're not wearing a mask or you're not wearing different kind of clothing to change who you are. I remember there was one classic year in the yeshiva, there was a fellow from England over here. People do all kinds of weird things on Purim. Sometimes they're pretty funny. And he'd been in the yeshiva for a while already, and he was like on track, learning, doing great, very frum, and he'd grown a beard. And he said that, I remember there was one Purim, he shaved off his beard, he left a moustache, shaved off his beard, got dressed up in the clothing that he used to wear when he first came to the yeshiva, and he told everybody that he was his twin. He says he's just arrived in the yeshiva, and he's the twin. I can't remember what the fellow's name was. He's like, I'm David's twin. And he had everyone in the yeshiva was convinced that this was true, and it was really funny. He was like walking around all day long, and people, oh, you look just like we're twins, identical twins. So there's lots of things to do. You can become somebody else on Purim. That's one of the things that they say psychologically when people get dressed up on Purim, that they get dressed up into who they'd like to be. Right, Moshe? So if you're thinking of getting dressed up as a woman, I think just. Keep that one in mind, right? No, I'm going to get dressed up as a man for Purim. That's my innermost desire. But it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to sort of tap into your inner self. I heard a very fascinating idea. This idea of getting drunk. Which, we'll talk about the halachas of getting drunk. Next week at some point. But bli neder. But the idea of getting drunk, that the Gemara says that when you get drunk, so you reveal your inner being, you reveal who you really are. Now the Gemara says, that you're known through 3 different dimensions. Bekisoi, the way that you deal with your finances. Bekaso, the way you are when you get angry. And bekoisoi, when you get drunk. There's certain things that, like, I don't know, those three things that push a person, they sort of like, all of a sudden you can be very refined and you can be very genteel, but when somebody tries to do something and it touches on one of those dimensions, all of a sudden the real you comes out. And the idea of getting drunk, when people get drunk, just as you know better than I do, I'm sure, that when people get drunk, so all of a sudden sometimes they become different, completely different to who they normally are. And one of the ideas of Purim is that if you know through the year, you know that there's a day when the chances are you're going to get drunk, then you'll spend the year hopefully working on yourself so that there isn't a great power between what you're like when you are drunk and when you're not drunk. That doesn't mean that you spend the year working on becoming awful and terrible so that when you become drunk and you're awful and terrible, people will say, oh, look, he's just the same. But rather the other way around. You work on yourself to become, to refine your inner being and to become better than you were in order that when you get drunk, that's what people should see. And I always tell over this story. For me, it was a big eye-opener. My parents had a friend. They had friends, and one of the friends was for me as a small kid, he was like this really ferocious looking fellow. He had a big wild beard and great big eyes, and he was Scottish, so he spoke with this very thick accent, and he liked to drink. And I was terrified of him as a kid. I really was. I mean, a kid, I'm talking about 11 or 12 years old. I'm not talking about 5. Like I tried to stay away from this fellow as much as I could. I was sure that this guy was like some kind of homicidal maniac, and that's the way he looked to me, and that's the way he sounded as well. And one Purim, my parents made me. I had to take Mishloach Manot. We'll talk about what they are in Mitzvah Hashem next week, the mitzvahs of Purim, but to take around food as a gift, and one of the places I had to go to was that family. I didn't want to do it, but. Well, I had no other alternative, so I got on my bike and I went riding over there, and I get off of my bike and somebody lets me into the house, and there is this fellow, this ferocious, this homicidal nut, right, completely drunk, sitting on the floor. He'd drawn ducks on the floor, on the kitchen floor, and he was trying to feed them bread. And I suddenly realized, if the Gemara says that that's how somebody's known, right? When you get drunk, that's you coming out. That's really who you are. And there was this fellow who I looked at as being like, terrifying. What's he doing? Sitting on the floor, just trying to feed bread to some ducks that he'd drawn, right? Draw them on the floor and trying to. It was interesting. His wife was an artist and he was a writer. They were a very literary couple. And it was so funny for me to see this. It was like I suddenly realized, this fellow. And from then on, I never looked at him the same way again. I was never scared of him again because I realized, this guy, he's really a gentle guy. He really is. He just looked a little wild. That's all.
He's not a homicidal maniac. He's just a maniac.
That's what it sounds like. But that's definitely better, given the choice between the two, right? I don't know who you would prefer to meet down a dark alley, but I think somebody who's just a maniac as opposed to a homicidal maniac is probably better. That's what I think. But the idea of knowing, so I always tell everybody like this: if on Purim, if you're like when you get drunk, if you get out of control and you do all kinds of things that you'd be ashamed afterwards, then you shouldn't be getting drunk on Purim. You really shouldn't. You should be working on yourself in Mitzvah Hashem so that when the next Purim comes rolling around, you can sort of then you can get drunk without being scared of what the repercussions are going to be. And that's again another. It's all the same dimensions. Adar is all the dimensions of things hidden away, and being able to tap into that hidden potential, tapping into it. And perhaps that's all the reason why Adar is the month. It's the last month of the winter, and the month of the winter is really the idea of the darkness and the cold and the thing the potential being hidden away under the ground and slowly but surely going to work its way out, and it's going to come out in the springtime. We're going to be able to see these things, and that's really why Adar heralds the end of the winter. And allows us to sort of recognize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is everywhere, even when we don't see him. And that brings us round full circle to Nisan, to the month of Nisan, and the idea of rejuvenation and redemption and growth, which is hopefully what we've been able to do throughout the entire year. Good. I'm going to take that as stunned silence because I don't know what the alternative is. And in Mitzvah Hashem, we're gonna stop over here. Yeah, okay, we did okay. We're going to stop over here for today in Mitzvah Hashem. Next week, like I said, we're going to start learning the halachot of Purim. So please come, dressed appropriately. And I'm letting you know now, we're only going to start learning the halachot of getting drunk at the end. Because if we learn them at the beginning, then you won't come afterwards, right? Once you've learned how you need to get drunk and when and what, then you won't come back again. So we're going to learn all the other halachas before we learn the halachas getting drunk. That's something you're going to have to wait for. And in the meantime, we're going to stop over here. And as always, right, tomorrow is the best day of the week because I don't have to come in. Yeah. And we'll meet back here on Sunday, as always, bleary-eyed, hungover, wishing to be anywhere else but here. Right?
Amen.